Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's GHG Coordination Working Group. I hope you all enjoyed the long holiday weekend with friends and family, but welcome back. Before we get started, just a reminder that the presentation materials that we'll be sharing today are available out on the GHG Coordination Working Group webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. And then on that main homepage, you'll see the Stay Informed tab. Under that tab, you'll see Policy Initiatives. If you click that, that will take you out to our main initiative landing page where you can search for the GHG Coordination Working Group page. And then the documents will be some of the very first posted on that page. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be your facilitator today. I'm also joined on the line by some members of our ISO team, including Kevin Head, who will be taking us through a presentation later today. So this call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These collaborative working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. And while we always welcome comments and feedback, just a reminder to please keep those professional and respectful. We will be pausing for questions and comments throughout the working group today. So if you connected to audio through your computer using the Call Me option in WebEx, you can select the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and that will enter you into the queue. If you dialed into the conference outside of the WebEx, you'll need to press #2 on your telephone keypad, and that will raise your hand on the phone lines. And then just a reminder to everyone participating today to please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question so we know who the comment or question is coming from. And then you can also send your question through the chat to all panelists, so we'll be keeping an eye on those as well. And then just a general note to everyone on the line today, just please be reminded that commissioners and advisors from state public utility commissions may be in attendance. All right, so the agenda for today, I'll finish up introductions here in just a moment, and then I'm going to turn things over to Kevin Head for a presentation on the ISO's current and potential GHG metrics that are currently published or thinking about potentially publishing. And then after Kevin's presentation, we'll move into a discussion on reporting requirements. So we'll hear from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So we have Elizabeth Elbel joining us today for our presentation on Oregon's GHG reporting requirements. And then we will also hear from PacifiCorp on the complexities of a multi-jurisdictional utility. And Zipir Shahimyan will be joining us for that presentation. And then we'll break for lunch and come back and discuss some of the consolidated problem statements that we've put together based on some of the feedback we received during the October working group discussions. And then we will leave some time at the end today to go over the working group schedule and some next steps. So this slide here just shows where we are at in our working group progress. So we have moved on from the principal discussion into the discussion more focusing on problem statements and assessment of those problem statements. And then once we've completed our assessment of the problems, then we'll start discussing some potential resolutions. All right, with that, I will hand things over to Kevin Head for his presentation on the current and potential GHG metrics published by KAISO.
Thanks, Isabella. Can you hear me coming through okay?
Yes.
Great, cool. Hey everyone, my name is Kevin Head. As Isabella said, I'm in the market analysis group at the ISO, and I'll be talking through some of the current and potential metrics we have related to greenhouse gases. So next slide, please. So we've heard a lot through, one back, please. We've heard a lot through these working groups about the desire from stakeholders to provide various metrics regarding both the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the ISO's markets, as well as the performance of the market design that we have around greenhouse gas. And we wanted to set the stage a little bit with talking about some of the metrics that we currently publish, as well as looking down the road, some plans to report additional metrics and how we as a working group might go about deciding which metrics to publish. So that's the scope of today's presentation, and I'll start with the current metrics on the next slide, please. All right, so we already published some metrics regarding greenhouse gases. Some of those are public and one of them is non-public. So I'll just go through each of these on the next few slides, and then I'll open the call up for some questions about the current and existing metrics that we publish. So next slide, please. So the first one that I'd like to discuss is the ISO's daily outlook. This is a daily look at the emissions associated with energy that serves load in only the ISO's BAA. And this uses metered energy, so actual energy that is being generated and transacted through the market. I want to talk about some assumptions that underlie this metric and then other metrics so we can sort of see, compare and contrast how they relate to each other. So I'll highlight two of those assumptions. So first is the emissions rate that's used for the generating resources. So this report uses predefined emissions rate by fuel type. And that's in contrast to some other metrics, which we'll see shortly, that actually use resource-specific emissions rate based on what's registered in master file. But this ISO's daily outlook uses some predefined emissions rate by fuel type. So for example, all gas resources would have the same emissions associated with them. The second assumption that I want to look at is the emissions rate that's used for imports and exports. So this daily outlook uses the unspecified rate of 0.428 tons per megawatt hour to quantify the emissions associated with net imports and exports from the ISO's BAA. And you can see this link at the bottom of the page. Next slide, please. So the next one is what we call the greenhouse gas emissions tracking report. This zooms out a little bit and is more of a monthly and annual look at the emissions associated with serving the ISO's BAA. In contrast to the daily outlook, this uses energy based on 5-minute market awards, so the RTD market results. And those might not perfectly match up to what metered energy is for that interval of time. This, in contrast to the daily outlook, also uses master file registered emissions rate instead of those predefined emissions rates. And that's only if we have that data available. If we don't have it available, we fill in using some predefined emissions rates. And similar to the daily outlook, we do assign the emissions associated with imports based on that unspecified rate of 0.428 tons per megawatt hour. And you can see here we have 4 different graphics which look at the data a little bit differently. And it goes back, I think, all the way to 2014 or 2017. I can't remember which. But yeah, and the link's down here at the bottom. We publish that report monthly. So next slide, please. All right, so finally we have a report that's called the Greenhouse Gas Attributions by Fuel Type. This used to be called the WEIM transfer into ISO by fuel type, but we just recently changed the name. This is reported in our monthly market performance reports, which are actually really cool reports that I encourage everyone to check out. This is at the very bottom of section 8 in that report. And that section 8 deals with kind of WEIM more broadly. And I'll talk a bit about what this report means. So just a little bit of background, the WEIM has this deeming mechanism, this attribution mechanism that we're familiar with. And one way of looking at that metric or that mechanism is a way to assign the WEIM transfers coming into California BAAs to specific resources. So it's sort of an assignment mechanism. And this report shows how those assignments, those greenhouse gas attributions, greenhouse gas awards, are allocated to different resources based on those resources' fuel type. And it shows that trend over time. And you can see here that it's mostly to hydro resources, and it varies based on how much it goes to gas and other resources and coal as well. And yeah, that's sort of it on that one and for the public reports. The next slide, please. The next slide has some non-public data that's only available to WEIM participating resource scheduling coordinators. And that's through our customer market results interface, or CMRI. CMRI has a variety of non-public information, and that's because it's usually commercially sensitive data, so we don't publish it publicly. But what this report does, it's essentially your 15-minute and 5-minute market awards. But this particular filter that I show here is the resource-specific greenhouse gas attributions. And again, those are only available to the particular participating resource scheduling coordinator who schedules these resources. And these 5-minute market results are what form the basis of what's reported to the California Air Resources Board for compliance with their programs related to WEIM. So, we're not going to get into the details of that, but that's sort of the background there. So those are the 4 reports that we currently publish related to greenhouse gas attributions on a regular basis. We have had some ad hoc data published in a variety of forums, but I didn't cover that in this presentation. But maybe I can pause here to see if any folks have questions related to any of the current reports that we publish before we move into the potential future data that we might publish in the future. So,
Yeah, looks like we have a hand from Claire. Let's go ahead and unmute Claire's line.
Power Trading Forum. Just a question about the attribution by fuel type slide. Are you guys also tracking offers, greenhouse gas offers by fuel type?
we don't publish that information, but we have it available through the data that is submitted by market participants, but we don't explicitly publish that data.
Can we unmute Claire's line again if she still has her hand up? It looks like it was lowered. Any other questions? Do we have any questions on the phone line? Okay.
No questions.
Cool. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, and thanks, Claire, for that question. And if anybody has any questions about the current reports later on, we'll open the call back up for some discussion. So the next slide, and this is when we move into sort of my second part of my presentation, is talking about some potential future metrics that we could report related to greenhouse gas. And, from the ISO's perspective, our goal is to increase the transparency of the market results to market participants and to assist market participants in their compliance and reporting requirements. And we hope that this working group effort will help inform how we go about doing that. And when we get into some of the nitty-gritty of which metrics to report, we also want to think through how frequently this data is reported, the granularity of the data that we report, and get your feedback on that. And as an example, we thought it might be useful to talk through a metric that we're calling an average emissions rate. And we'd like to use this working group and future working groups to talk about how we could go about calculating this metric. And we thought having a tangible metric might be useful in that effort. And so we've come up with a sample or example methodology of calculating an average emissions rate, and we'll publish the data that underlies some of these questions on the website sometime today or tomorrow. So I'll talk a bit about an average emissions rate. If you could go to the next slide. All right, so I'll just talk about an average emissions rate and some of the considerations that we think it'd be useful to discuss as a working group. And the next few slides will talk about each of these 4 questions. So the first consideration to have is, which resources would an average emissions rate reflect? Next would be, are we looking at all of the schedules arising related to those resources? Or should we only look at the schedules that are relative to the WEIM base schedule? Third would be what to do with bilateral transactions that occur outside of the WEIM. And fourth would be what to do in situations where there's missing data. But before we dig too far into that, we want to make it clear that this average emissions rate that we're discussing today isn't intended to replace or supplant any marginal unspecified emissions rates that are used by other state and reporting and compliance programs, unless those state or regulatory bodies go through a rulemaking process and buy off on it. This is merely just to discuss the methodology of how this metric could be calculated, and to sort of start the discussion of thinking through more broadly how we might want to tackle questions of new data to be published. So don't think that this is the ISO coming out to intend to change the unspecified emissions rate that's currently used in other forums. So next slide talks about that first consideration of an average emissions rate. And just a little bit of background, I view the average emissions rate as a pretty simple calculation on its face, at least, because it's basically the metric tons of CO2 equivalent, the greenhouse gas emissions, divided by the energy output in megawatt hours. So it's a pretty simple formula, but of course the devil's in the details. So one example of where it gets a little complicated is, which resource categories do we want to include in this calculation? So I think it's pretty clear that we would want to include some or all supply resources. So think of this as traditional generating resources, your gas resources, your hydro, etc. But where it starts to get a little hairy is what to do with demand response resources. So as an example, for the ISO's balancing authority area, the market results treat demand response resources as supply resources. So if a demand response resource gets a market award of 10 megawatts, we expect there to be a reduction in demand of 10 megawatts, but the market will have an output of 10 megawatts as a supply, as a positive value. So one question would be, do we want to remove that value in coming up with the average emissions rate? And the way that would affect the average emissions rate is there would probably be no emissions associated with that resource schedule, but it would decrease the energy output related to that energy schedule. And so that would actually have the net effect of, increasing the average emissions rate because we're decreasing the denominator. Next is energy storage resources. We've seen the proliferation of these energy storage resources across both California and the broader Western interconnection. And so we'll probably have to figure out how to factor these into the average emissions rate calculation. And when I think about it, I think of 2 main considerations. So first would be that energy storage resources don't generate any energy, but they do shift when that generated energy serves demand. And assuming that the energy storage resources are perfectly efficient, that won't have a net effect on the total average emissions rate. But if we look at maybe an hourly metric, that could change the average emissions rate throughout the day based on when those resources are charging and discharging. Also, the way that our market provides results related to energy storage resources is that when they're charging, it's considered a negative energy schedule. And when they're discharging, it's a positive energy schedule. And as we know, as I mentioned earlier, the assumption that they're perfectly efficient doesn't hold true. Energy storage resources require more energy to charge than they do end up discharging, because of their less than perfect round trip efficiency. And so when you combine those two facts, the fact that the charge schedules are negative and discharges are positive, as well as not perfectly efficient resources, that results in a net impact to the denominator of this equation, basically decreasing the denominator of the equation and thus increasing the average emissions rate when looked at maybe on a larger annual time frame. And then finally, we would want to think through which resources were attributed to serve California. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a deeming mechanism for resources that are located outside of California. They can bid in to serve demand in California. Well, the question when calculating an average emissions rate would be, do we include those schedules associated with the resources that we're serving California, or do we exclude them? And that could be a yes and a no, depending on what the use of this data is and kind of the overall intention of the metric. So I've talked for a little while. Maybe I can open up the call to any folks who have questions about the overall framing of the average emissions rate discussion today, as well as this first consideration and whether folks have any thoughts on this or questions about it.
Yeah, we have a hand from Jessica Zano.
I apologize. That was a lot of dense information. I wonder if you could go back to the DR example and talk that one through again. I kind of wasn't tracking that completely. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So the idea is how to treat demand response resources in the average emissions rate calculation. And for the ISO's balancing authority area, when a demand response resource gets an energy award, that is effectively telling that DR resource, hey, decrease your energy output, or decrease the demand that you have. So as an example, assume that it's a large industrial facility and we're asking that resource to, or that facility to slow its production or shut off one of its manufacturing lines to decrease the energy demand associated with that manufacturing process. We would issue that resource a 10 megawatt schedule, for example, and that would be saying, hey, decrease your demand by 10 megawatts. But the market results show that as a positive 10 megawatts from a supply resource. And so we might want to back out that 10 megawatts from the average emissions rate calculation to only focus on the generated energy rather than energy that's associated with decreased demand. Does that make sense? I think she's still on mute. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, it does make sense. And I think the point you made was that it could have the effect of increasing the average emissions rate because you're lowering the denominator.
Yeah.
Yep. But essentially, you're also lowering the numerator, potentially, because the emissions are less.
I think the emissions would stay the same.
Well, wouldn't it have a paired, like that demand, had it not received the schedule, it would have a paired supply resource to provide that demand that would have associated emissions potentially?
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I see your point. The way that I've formulated the example calculation, which we'll publish in the next day or two, the way it works is it for a traditional supply resource, say it's a gas facility, it'll take that resource's market schedule and multiply it by an emissions rate. And so it's sort of a ground up total of all the generation in the ISO's market, including the WEIM. For demand response resources, we would, without any changes to the calculation, we would have a positive energy output, but there's no registered emissions rate associated with that demand response resource. Their emissions rate in our master file, at least, is 0. So point taken that you're right that there's emissions associated with serving demand, but the demand response resources, based on how we sort of come up with the calculation, don't have a registered emissions rate. And so it would leave the numerator the same, but decrease the denominator.
Yeah, I got you. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's unmute Mary Wenke.
Good morning. This is Mary Winkie from the Public Generating Pool. Kevin, I just have a question about this. I think, and I'm not sure if I missed something, but you noted that this was not kind of meant to supplant or replace any kind of a regulatory emissions rate. But what would the purpose of this, like what would we be trying to capture with this calculation? Is it kind of a average emissions rate for the whole footprint? Is it for imports to California? Something else? I think that answer to that question would help, I think, also answer some of these questions about what to include and what not to include.
Yeah, I think we would want to hear from the stakeholder community as to what they would want that, like the purpose of this to be. So I guess where I'm coming from is, here's the data that we have available to us as the market operator. And as we were thinking through how we might go about calculating an average emissions rate, here are 4 questions that we sort of bumped on. But we expect the working group process to help think through the overall purpose, or purposes maybe, of an average emissions rate. And then we can use those, underlying reasons for the calculation to drive, exactly as you were saying, some of these questions, the answers to some of these questions. Does that make sense, Mary?
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
Let's unmute Claire.
Hi again. Thanks for this, Kevin. And I'm encouraged to see you guys thinking along this line. A couple of high-level comments. First is, I've said this before, I think you guys should really be trying to err on the side of comprehensive data. If you can think of different ways of parsing out the data, present it in those different ways, because I think it will be valuable to participants. And in that regard, I think you need to think about different ways of establishing boundaries or around different categories of energy. So you could have, for instance, envision an average for the entire market footprint. You could envision an average for resources that are deemed to California. You could also envision an average of residual market resources. In other words, an average that removes any resources that are attributed to California or to Washington, and also potentially envision that there may be other claims to resources that we may want to bake back out of that residual calculation. The other thing I just want to highlight, you had mentioned on the previous slide the possibility that this isn't intended to in any way undercut or replace a marginal calculation that may be used in regulatory programs, but you haven't flagged it as another data point that you guys could also provide, because at any point in time in the market, there is going to be a marginal emission factor, which is not going to necessarily be obvious to people from these averages. And so that is a data point that I think is actually very important. The other thing I would flag is I do want us to think about different time frames and different granularity in terms of market intervals. You know, this data may look very different on a 5-year basis, a 15-minute basis, sorry, 5-minute, 15-minute, hourly, annual, and think about those. And I know this sounds like a lot of data, but it is valuable data. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you corrected from 15 years because I was envisioning our ISO servers smoking. So thanks, Claire. That's great feedback.
Stuart, let's unmute Stuart's line.
Representing LA, similar point to Claire. I don't see why we would want to limit ourselves to a single average emission rate. I would like to see, you know, a suite of data, you know, average emission rate with demand response resources, without demand response resources, so on and so forth, similar to Claire, with self schedules and without self schedules. I think that would be far more informative and also allow us to compare to the marginal emission rate over various time periods.
Yeah, great, thank you. All right, any other questions on this, or I can move to the next slide? Not seeing any.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any either.
Cool. Okay, so the next kind of wider reaching consideration that we'd want to think through is which schedules the average emissions rate metric would look at. And what I mean by that is, do we look at only those schedules that are relative to the WEIM submitted base schedule, or do we look at all schedules arising from the WEIM? So I'll start with a little bit of background. So for some folks, this might be basic, but the WEIM uses a concept called base schedules, which can be thought of in this context as the generation or the bilateral imports and exports that the WEIM entity intends to use to serve for their native load. And those base schedules are an input into the market, but the WEIM market optimization can and often does result in a resource schedule which is different from that initial base schedule expectation. And the base, if that resultant energy schedule is different from the base schedule, if it's above, that's what we call an incremental schedule. Or if it's below, that's what we call a decremental schedule. So just a couple examples here. So if a resource has a 40 megawatt base schedule, that's what that WEIM entity says, hey, I need 40 megawatts to serve my own load absent the participation in the WEIM. Well, then the WEIM optimization comes along, it does its magic and says, hey, we actually need that resource to generate 50 megawatts. Maybe it's more economic than a resource in a neighboring balancing authority area. So it receives a higher award based on those economic displacement. So that would be a 10 megawatt incremental schedule. A different example would be if that same resource has a 40 megawatt base schedule, but receives a 25 megawatt award from the WEIM, that would be a 15 megawatt decremental schedule. So the question is do we want the average emissions rate to reflect just the incremental and decremental schedules, or do we look at the final WEIM optimization result? And there's different schools of thought. And the next slide talks about some of those considerations that could help us think through this conversation. So please move to the next slide if you wouldn't mind. Great, thank you. So just to help tease out some of the pros and cons of the two different approaches. So looking at all the resource schedules, I think is more intuitive and easier to understand for someone who's sort of just picking up this metric and isn't familiar with the ISO's market design. It also is a bit more in line with the overall physical principles of the overall electricity system. It's not like a particular electron that's generated serves a particular load. All the generation feeds into a single pool, and that pool is what serves demand. And so looking at all resource schedules is a bit more in line with that physical principle. And it's also more in line with capturing the overall emissions at the system level at a particular snapshot in time. But it might not capture the principles of a market. And what I mean by that is when we look at just schedules that are relative to the base schedule, it's sort of analogous to being like looking at the marginal change as a result of the WEIM. So if you look at just the incremental schedule that occurs, in my previous example, that 10 megawatt incremental schedule, that would, in some ways of thinking, be kind of looking at more of like a marginal change in emissions as a result of participation in the WEIM. But, as we know, those base schedules aren't always a perfectly objective baseline. So, it reflects a particular scheduling coordinator's belief of how much energy that resource might need, but that might not be what would have occurred had that scheduling coordinator had a broader view of all of the bids and offers and levels of demand, et cetera, of the entire WEIM market system. So those base schedules might not be the perfectly objective baseline against which to compare our changes. And further, this could result in some unusual situations. So if there's a net decremental schedule as a whole from the EIM that has the potential to come up with a negative emissions rate, which could be a little wonky if this was used in certain situations. So maybe I can open it up to see if folks have any questions or feelings about whether this average emissions rate could look at all schedules or just those relative to the base schedule. And then, I recognize Stuart's comment that there might be a way to show all of these different metrics, and I'm not trying to limit that at this stage. I just wanted to tease out some of the thinking behind how we might proceed down this road. So does anyone have any questions, comments?
Yeah, we do have a hand in queue from Callie Wells.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I really appreciate you throwing both of these options out there, and I think the pros and cons list really helps kind of the conversation. I do think maybe having both flavors of these to some extent would be useful. But one other question I had is obviously, this is talking specifically about WEAM, but under EDAM, have you guys thought about what would make sense in that context? And then, one step further is, well, if you have some BAAs and EDAM, when you get to WEAM, the quote unquote base schedule is actually going to be based on their day ahead schedule, not necessarily what they submit as a base schedule. So at some point, I think it would be useful to have that conversation and maybe take it more initially starting with the day ahead time frame and then moving into the WEAM, because I think you might get different answers or different reactions based on whether or not that BAA is an EDAM and WEAM or just WEAM.
Yeah, that's a great point. And and I haven't really thought that through. You know, in some respects, as you were saying, you know, the day ahead is an integrated forward market, so it's not the actual flow of energy. But as you also point out, which is a good point, it does change what that baseline, that sort of counterfactual is. And so any schedules incremental to that might be viewed a bit differently than if they were incremental to a base schedule. So great point, great thought. And I'll make sure we flag that for future conversations. All right, do we have any other questions?
Adrian, do we have any questions on the phone only line?
No questions on the phone only line.
Okay, cool. So I'll move to the next slide, please. So the third consideration we'd want to think through is how bilateral transactions between balancing authorities would be treated. And just a bit of background here, the ISO's markets, including the WEIM, allow for imports and exports to be transacted outside of the WEIM. In other words, they're transacted bilaterally between two balancing authority areas. And those could be two WEIM balancing authority areas or a non-WEIM balancing authority area and one that participates in the EIM. And, you know, we probably want to think through how the average emissions rate calculation treats those different types of transactions. And the complication here is that those transactions, at least from the ISO's perspective, aren't traceable back to a specific resource. We just see it as, you know, basically like an e-tag or an hourly schedule coming into our market, but we don't necessarily know what the underlying generating resource that's supporting that transaction is. And so that makes the emissions rate associated with that schedule ambiguous. So we'd want to think through, do we want to factor those transactions into the average emissions rate calculation, or just say, hey, you know, we don't have the transparency into those, so let's just leave them out. But say we do decide to include them, you know, how could the average emissions rate calculation go about assigning an emissions rate to those unspecified imports? Do we use the marginal unspecified rate, for example? Maybe we want to use a historical average of emissions. I guess it just sort of depends, but this is more of from the ISO's market operator perspective, sharing that we probably don't have all of the information for the resources that are supporting these transactions. So we likely need to make an assumption about the emissions associated with these transactions. So that's one flavor of missing data, and I'll group the next one in there as well, and then take questions after that. So Adrian, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. There's also some other missing data that the ISO doesn't have, or data that the ISO doesn't have available to us. So we don't have the emissions rates or heat rates for every resource that participates in the WEIM, or even doesn't participate in the EIM, but is in a WEIM balancing authority area. We have certain requirements for when those emissions rates need to be registered in our master file, and we just don't have the emissions rates for all of the resources. So we'd be faced with a situation where we need to fill in the emissions rates and the heat rates and other types of market or associated data in order to make sure that we're capturing all of the emissions and energy schedules. Some ways that this could be done was, hey, look at some other similar resources in the master file and use that to sort of interpolate the emissions rate associated with a particular resource that we're missing data on. Or we could go to like a publicly available source like the EIA or the EPA and use some publicly available emissions rates for those. So that's just a flavor of some of the missing data. Some of it's related to bilateral transactions, and some of it is related to specific generating resources that we just don't have the emissions rates for. So maybe I can open up the call again, just to see if anyone has any questions about missing or incomplete data.
Unmute Claire.
Thanks again, Kevin. You're going to have a tag team of Kelly and I today, but we'll try to go easy on you. So if we could go back to the last slide first, and I'll hit my comments there, and then I did have a question and comment in this slide. So on the issue of the bilateral transactions, I think that's something that is going to become more and more important. We know that there are a number of states with non-pricing programs that are very much worried about how utilities in those states are going to account for generation emissions associated with serving loads. So I think having a mechanism to be able to track those bilateral transactions is important. I would say, however, that this is something that I don't think that the CAISO necessarily has to take fully on itself, but should instead be thinking of a mechanism that allows entities to claim particular resources or to reflect that these resources are committed to me, and thus be attributed to specific entities or specific states. I also note that I think we need to dive into whether there's any expectation of actual physical transfers between BAAs. Your slide seems to imply that there is an expectation that you're only tracking where there's a transfer. I'm not sure that we would be comfortable with that approach because, to date, our attribution of resources to California, for instance, is not contingent on a physical transfer, but is an attribution. And so I think for consistency, we could think similarly about any sort of attribution associated with other bilateral transfers. Moving to this slide, I have a question first, which is I'm not fully understanding why you would not have, at the very least, heat rates for fossil resources, for gas resources that are participating in your market. Am I missing something there?
Yeah, the key point is participating. So we do, for the purposes of our full network model, we have both the WEIM participating resources and WEIM non-participating resources. So those are the resources that the particular WEIM entity doesn't want to participate in the WEIM. And for those non-participating resources, we don't require them to register their heat rate data because we don't use that data anywhere in the market. It's not used to calculate, a default energy bid, for example, or a minimum load cost. So there's some cases where we have resources that don't have registered heat rates.
And so are you expecting that those resources would impact the baseline? And I guess my third question, turns out I have three questions. If it's not limited to just determining a baseline, I guess I'm not following why you would think that those the emissions and generation of the non-participating resources should be reflected in the calculation of an emission rate.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it might even go back to my first consideration that I had posted, like item number 1, for lack of a better term here, but it would be, sort of an implicit assumption baked into item number 1 was we would include both participating and non-participating resources, the schedules associated with those, and the emissions associated with those. So we might, when developing this metric, not want to include the non-participating resources, which would sort of obviate the concern that we were just discussing. But it's a question for the working group. Do we want to include participating only or include both participating and non-participating? So it's a good question, and sorry for not teasing that point out a bit earlier in the presentation. And thanks also for your other comments about bilateral transactions and the importance of those. Thanks. Any other questions, or I can move to my last slide?
I'm not seeing any.
Cool. Okay. All right, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, we're planning on publishing some example data for an average emissions rate metric. And that's just to help illustrate some of the conversation that we had today and to show what this could look like in the future. In that average emissions rate metric that we'll be publishing probably on the initiative webpage for this working group are some of these underlying assumptions kind of put into action. And what I mean by that is we had to make certain assumptions along the way. And these don't necessarily reflect on what we think is best or where we think the working group should go, but we wanted to at least put something out there for discussion purposes. And to do that, we had to make some assumptions along the way. So the assumptions that we made are sort of included on this slide, and they'll be included in the underlying data. But basically, the example metric that we put out assumes that all supply resources are included, both participating and non-participating resources. We back out demand response resource schedules, but we include energy storage resources. For resources that were historically attributed to serve California, we don't back those out. We don't exclude those, so they're included in the total. And we include all schedules, not just those schedules that are relative to the WEIM-based schedule. And then we do include bilateral transactions. We don't leave those out. And we assign them a default emissions rate using the unspecified rate of 0.428. And then we filled in some missing data using weighted averages from similar resources, the data that's registered in master file. We use to come up with those weighted averages of emissions rates and heat rates. So again, these are just to be explicit as to the assumptions we made in the data that we'll be publishing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect what we think is the best, or we don't want it to affect the working group's discussion on the relative merits of each of these approaches. So keep an eye out for that data to be published a bit later. And yeah, that's sort of it, but I'm happy to take any more questions if folks have some.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And we'll work to get that example metric document posted to the webpage later today. So that will be available along with all the other materials on the working group webpage.
Thanks.
We do have a hand up, or a couple hands up. So let's go to Zapir from Pacific Core.
Hey, Zapir, we can't hear you quite yet, but looks like you're unmuted.
You might be muted on your device. It looks like she might have dropped audio. Let's go to Greg Alderson from PGE.
Greg, we're also in trouble hearing you too.
Hey, you may be muted on your own device. Well, it looks like we got Zapir's audio back, so maybe while Greg is working on his audio, we can go back to Zapir.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So I had a question about the bilateral transactions. So when you attribute unspecified, I'm just wanting to make sure that it's like unidirectional, I guess. So if there's an exchange between BAAs back and forth, we could realize inflation of emissions as a result of applying emissions to unspecified that were potentially already accounted for as part of the generation. I'm curious if you are making any assumptions around that, or what analysis you're applying to make sure we don't double count emissions as part of both the generation and the transaction.
Yeah. So, good question. I'll sort of break that into two pieces. So, first would be if the bilateral transaction is between two WEIM BAAs. What the market results do is they create, say, I don't know, Idaho Power conducts a transaction with Nevada Power, just two examples. Nevada, the Idaho, say it's exporting to Nevada. If that was a 100 megawatt transaction, that would show up in our market as a negative 100 schedule associated with Idaho's BA, and then a positive 100 associated with Nevada's BA. And so those two would net each other out. And so there would be no net impact on the average emissions rate. And so in that case, we don't need to worry about double counting between the transaction itself and the underlying generating resource. So that's in the case of WEIM transactions. If there is a if the transaction is between a non-EIM entity and an EIM entity, then that's where it impacts the calculation. And we don't make any effort to back out the emissions and the energy associated with that. So say a resource is in an EIM entity and it's exporting to a non-EIM area. The calculation would have emissions and energy associated with the generating resource, and then it would also have effectively negative emissions and negative energy output associated with the export. The generation transaction would be at the resource-specific emissions rate registered in master file, but the export would be at the unspecified rate of 0.428, at least in the way that we formulated it in the example. So there's a chance that would affect the average emissions rate calculation, and it would just depend on the relative emissions rate of that particular resource compared to the unspecified rate of 0.428. So kind of a long answer to your question, but was that helpful, Sapir?
That is. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, let's go back to Greg Alderson.
I just wanted to thank Kevin and the CAISO team for thinking through some of this. I think there's a lot of different ways that this kind of data could be valuable. I sort of echo what Claire was talking about, saying that the answer may be to provide a few different versions of an AER, but I think there's a lot of value here, and I'm looking forward to continuing to think through some of these things.
Great. Thanks, Greg.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments from the group? All right, not seeing any. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. Looking back on a lot of the problem statements that were submitted back in the October working group timeframe, a lot of it focused on data and reporting requirements and what data the ISO currently provides versus what it could provide to help support some of those compliance and then other reporting requirements across the states. So I think it's helpful to understand what we currently provide and what we could provide to ultimately support those things. So thank you very much. All right, now I will hand it over to Elizabeth Elbel from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and she'll be giving a presentation on the Oregon GHG reporting requirements. So Adrian, if we could promote Elizabeth up to the panelist group and pull up her presentation as well. All right, and I'll turn things over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Elbel, and I'm with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And I was asked to share an overview of our reporting program and then some of our emission reduction requirements for the state, just to kind of share out the Oregon perspective on this. And I'm going to apologize in advance for I have a little bit of a cough, so hopefully I'll keep that under control as I go through these slides. So we can move on to the next slide here. So what I'm planning to do is kind of go over Oregon's reporting requirements, talk a little bit about how our requirements prescribe some of the emission factors and calculations that we do, talk a little bit about just like the background and basics on our current emission reduction requirements. And I can take questions at the end or throughout, whatever is most helpful for the folks on the line. And we can go to the next slide. Great. And just, sorry, a little history here. So Oregon has had a greenhouse gas reporting program in place since 2010, and we've been collecting data from the state's largest emitters. So that includes electricity suppliers, which is what I'm talking about today, but we also cover other sectors as well, such as industrial facilities and fuel suppliers. But for our electricity suppliers and our applicability, we do use kind of a slightly different version than some of our neighboring states, since our reporting requirement is really on the load serving entity, and our rules use the term electricity suppliers. And that applies to anyone that imports, sells, allocates, or distributes electricity to an end user in Oregon. And what they kind of at a high level are reporting to us is the emissions from the generation of the electricity that they source and supply here in Oregon, regardless of where that generation occurs. So there's a portion of electricity that is generated in Oregon and used in other states, and that's not included in this electricity supplier report. But the portion of electricity that is generated outside of the state and used in Oregon, the emissions associated with that are included, as well as anything generated within Oregon and used within Oregon. And you can go to the next slide. So kind of drilling down just a little bit into who these regulated electricity suppliers are. So Oregon has 3 investor-owned utilities. So that's Pacific Power, Idaho Power, and Portland General Electric. I think at the time this slide was made, we had around 5 electricity service suppliers. So those are the entities supplying direct access to customers in a utility territory. And then we have approximately 39 consumer-owned utilities. And I'll just pause here and say that not all of those utilities report directly to DEQ, because our rules do provide for what a third-party reporter that may report on behalf of these consumer-owned utilities. And a good example for that is that Bonneville Power Administration does report on behalf of some of their COUs if they are full requirements customers. And so I point this out because there are kind of third parties involved in some of these data reporting requirements. And the reason for that is to kind of reduce the administrative burden on these consumer-owned utilities. Next slide, please. So now we'll just kind of cover the basics of the reporting requirement. So as I mentioned, at a high level, they're reporting the emissions associated with the power served in Oregon. The data that we receive includes megawatt hours of power delivered and the associated greenhouse gas emissions from that generation. And the way that that is kind of disaggregated and reported to us is that they separately report out emissions of megawatt hours from each specified source as it's defined in our rules and from unspecified power. In our rules on an annual, and I should say this is an annual reporting requirement, they use our assigned emission factors for calculating these greenhouse gas emissions. And we do require a 2% transmission loss correction factor. That's part of our rule. And also share that we don't have any REC requirements tied to what is being reported. So like power reported with or without a REC is based on the generating source. So for example, if it was a wind generating source, it would be treated as wind regardless if it had its REC bundled with that. And then finally, for our multi-jurisdictional utilities such as PacifiCorp, they report their data and emissions based on a cost allocation approach, which is approved by our Oregon Public Utility Commission. And we can go to the next slide there. And oh, there you go. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, we kind of have two categories essentially of reporting. This is somewhat similar to our neighboring states as well. We have this specified source category, and for us, a specified source is one that the reporting entity, so the electricity supplier, is able to claim. And this includes facilities or units that they own or operate. And then power purchases where there's a written power contract to procure the electricity from that facility, and the contract needs to be in place prior to the delivery of that power. So there's no kind of after the fact accounting there. And electricity procured from an asset controlling supplier. This is also the same similar concept to California's rule, and that asset controlling supplier is an entity that manages maybe multiple resources and applies to Oregon to designate their resources or their system resources as a single specified source. And currently we have one of those, which is BPA. We do on an annual basis assign facility specific emission factors to each specified source. So those specified sources are registered by our electricity suppliers. We then assign an emission factor based on the source's total emissions over their megawatt hours. For a non-emitting resource, those are 0, obviously. For a GHG emitting resource, like I said, we would use total emissions over generation. We primarily rely on EPA or Oregon DEQ greenhouse gas reported data for the emissions, and then EIA data for our megawatt hour values to assign those emission factors. In some instances where those data sets aren't available, we do use like an average, or we have another methodology for that. And if you want to go to the next slide. So for our unspecified sources, this is a source of electricity that's not a specified source at the time of entry into the transaction. So we have a default emission factor for those resources. It's that 0.428 metric tons per megawatt hour. And I'll also mention currently in our rule, we require that any purchases from an energy imbalance or centralized market also use this default emission factor. So that we're using the same unspecified for market purchases as well. And then if you want to go to the next slide. So we do allow for a couple of adjustments, and I wanted to talk about how we kind of treat non-retail sales adjustments. It is slightly different for multi-jurisdictional utilities. Sorry. So for non-retail sales of a specified power resource, it's specified prior to the transaction. An electricity supplier would subtract that from their report based on the amount of power that was sold from that specified source and any associated emissions. If that electricity supplier was selling non-retail sales of power, but they didn't specify which resource it was at the time, then they're required to do a proportional adjustment to their entire resource stack to adjust for both megawatt hours and emissions that were sold. And as I mentioned, this does not apply to multi-jurisdictional reporting, but I can talk about that a little bit on our next slide if you want to jump to it. Sorry. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have a provision to allow and require for multi-jurisdiction utility reporting. This currently applies to Idaho Power and Pacificor here in Oregon. And these are electricity suppliers that provide retail power in Oregon and at least one other state. And what the difference here is that they supply to us the power and emissions associated with their system, and we then develop a system emission factor, and we allocate a share of that to Oregon based on the megawatt hours delivered here with adjustments for any transmission loss. So that system emission factor includes all of their purchased and wholesale purchased power from specified sources, unspecified sources, also their owned and operated facilities. We do adjust for any specified source sales, so those would be subtracted out of this system emission factor. And then, as I mentioned, we apply that system emission factor to the Oregon load. Next slide, please. So I just covered kind of the basics of our reporting, and I'm happy to go into more detail on that with questions, but to kind of let you know the status of our current emission reduction requirements. Again, these apply to our electricity suppliers. So in 2021, Oregon adopted House Bill 2021. It does a couple different things, but one of the big things that it does is it sets greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for specific electricity suppliers. So this doesn't apply to all of electricity suppliers. It applies to our two largest IOUs, so PGE and Pacificor, and our electricity service suppliers. And these are requirements to reduce the emissions associated with power served in Oregon. So it's inclusive of the same scope of emissions that I discussed in our greenhouse gas reporting program. And it does rely on that methodology for both reporting to DEQ on an annual basis and for determining compliance with these targets. And so the targets are described on the slide, but they are an 80% reduction from their baseline values, which I'll show you on the next slide, by 2030, a 90% reduction by 2035, and 100% reduction by 2040. A couple other components of HB 2021 include that PGE and Pacificor need to develop what are called clean energy plans. And these are essentially plans describing how they're going to reach these targets along with other elements of the bill. And they also have projections on their emissions and trajectory to meet these targets as well. Those are both, we're in the first year of that process. Both utilities have submitted plans, and those are under review by our Public Utility Commission. So we are kind of in the process of learning what this looks like as it moves forward. And then we can move to the next slide. And I think for context, I was just hoping to kind of add some data and detail for folks to understand where Oregon is at and where we need to get to. So on this slide, you can see PacifiCorp and PGE's baseline data. So that's the average of the annual anthropogenic emissions for the baseline years, which was 2010, 11, and 12. All of that is our historic greenhouse gas reported data. The blue line is emissions reported on an annual basis over that time period. So you can see from 2010 to 2021. And then at the bottom, you can see the emission targets for 2030, 2035, and 2040, just to kind of give everybody an idea of where we're at and where we need to go. Okay, and then I think the next slide is just transitioning over to any questions or clarifications that would be helpful.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And if anyone has any questions or comments for Elizabeth, you can enter the queue by raising your hand using the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Or if you connected to audio separately, you can press #2. Do we have any questions, comments? I see a hand from Greg Alderson.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just, given the conversation that we all had this morning around an average emissions rate and the presentation that Kevin gave, I was just wondering, how that strikes you, and if CAISO were to provide an average emissions rate of some kind like that, how might DEQ look at that or be interested in using it, given some of the data limitations that DEQ has had around markets that you mentioned?
Yeah, Greg, thank you for that question. What I will say is part of HB 2021 does direct DEQ to revisit both our unspecified emission rate and our accounting around markets. So we do plan to revisit those. I think we're following the conversation on developing regional markets very closely, especially around these data considerations. Obviously, we're a state agency, so any changes to our rules and reporting would have to go through, a robust public process for our rulemaking. But I do think as new data and information becomes available, we'd like to be able to refine that to help us better calculate our emissions and kind of determinations as they are associated with our targets, and also improve our emission accounting. I think as we're kind of observing the conversations, we are trying to make sure that we have robust accounting. So concerns around double counting. We also, as an environmental agency, also recognize the benefits of the markets for the region. So we don't want to impact those types of benefits of the market, but do need to get that kind of robust data, and would like our utilities to be able to use the system to procure clean energy. And so I think that we're hopeful that we can find the right accounting approach, and learning more about this data has definitely been helpful. So I guess that was like a long-winded way of saying, yes, we do plan to revisit it. I think it's a little hard with the development of the markets and the timeline of our rulemaking to know exactly when the right time to do that might be, but we're kind of sticking with it and working very closely with our Public Utility Commission and Department of Energy to learn more about the multiple processes that are happening right now. So thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Elizabeth? Any questions on the phone only line, Adrian?
No, nothing on the phone only line.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for your presentation today. I think it's really valuable.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right, so now we're going to hand things over to Zapur from PacifiCorp. So if we could move Zapur up to the panelist group and then pass her presenting rights, she'll go ahead and pull up the slides. All right, and I'll turn things over to you, Zapur. I can't hear you. Looks like Zapur is reconnecting audio, so we'll reconvene in just a moment.
Hello? Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Zapur. Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, wonderful. I had to switch audio. All right. Let me share my screen. Just confirming you can see my screen here.
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Okay, so thank you for everyone's time today. My name is Zapur Xiaomian. I'm the Director here of Energy and Environmental Policy at PacifiCorp. I'm going to walk through some pretty dense material today, so I ask in advance for your patience as I walk through this. We'll make the slides available, so there'll be opportunity to review and go back and consider some of this material. So my objective here is to provide an overview of PacifiCorp's multi-state utility landscape. I think it's an important part of setting context for the problem statements that we've offered. I am going to focus specifically on emissions accounting and like compliance reporting lens as part of my presentation. And I do have some recommendations around how we could do accounting on a multi-jurisdictional system like PacifiCorp's. I'm focusing a bit of my examples around Washington territory because we do have some unique issues related to how Washington state is positioned in our territory. We also have open rulemaking there around markets, so some of my examples are really focused there. But the principles can apply to our other states like Oregon and California as well. Think of this as a case study for multi-state BAA under multiple clean energy policies and GHG regulation areas in the context of EDAM. I'm really hoping that some of this can, be applicable to others who may face these issues. I also want to say that I've connected with our other multi-jurisdictional peers, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm really focusing on PacifiCorp and sort of our treatment, and I don't really want to speak on behalf of others as they may have unique considerations. So a little bit about PacifiCorp. We serve about 1.9 million customers across 6 states, so Oregon, Washington, California, Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. We have a balancing area authority with 2 BAAs, PacifiCorp East and East Pac West. We're also a transmission provider a wholesale power marketer. We joined EIM back in 2014. So we are EIM seller into California and Washington, and an EIM purchaser in California. We're also committed to join the EDAM. We're also subject to 20+ emissions and renewable disclosure compliance frameworks. Those include GHG price policies, so we're regulated under California Cap and Trade, as well as Washington's Climate Commitment Act. We also have a non-GHG pricing based policies like the ones that Elizabeth just covered in Oregon. We also have Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act, as well as RPS reporting and renewable portfolio goal in Utah. So a number of compliance frameworks around emissions accounting and renewable accounting that we're keeping track of and really considering what that looks like under EDAM. A little more about our system. So we have a pretty good geographic diversity, which means we can provide low-cost renewables where it's more productive, and it helps decarbonize the grid and prioritize affordability for our customers. So we have wind facilities located in eastern Wyoming, eastern Oregon, Washington, and Montana. We also have solar energy and storage facilities in Utah and Oregon. We also have a 16,900-mile high voltage transmission spanning 10 states, and expecting it to grow in our next IRP. So a little bit about how our customers share our system. It's important to note, and part of important part of PacifiCorp is that we dispatch as one system. So we operate as, even though we have the 6 states, we operate as a system. But our customers, retail customers within our states, are sharing the system in terms of, energy claims and renewable claims based on what they pay for. So it's not based on where the resource is located, but it's regardless of the location, it's based on their portfolio of resources that's included in the rates. We also have a unique provision in our cost allocation in Washington, which I'm not going to go into here, but it also creates some complexities around our accounting there. Environmental attributes such as RECs are consistent with this cost allocation, and so as RECs are generated in our system, they're shared based on these cost allocations. No coal requirement in Oregon is also enabled through this no coal and rates provision, and long-term clean energy plans, such as those under HB 2021 and Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act, are developed based on these cost allocation assumptions. So I want to spend a bit of time looking at the geographic spread of our retail load versus our generation. So here on the blue bars represent our load as across the states, and then the orange bar is the generation. And you can see there's a pretty big difference between our load and resource spread. If you were looking at the actual electrons or generation relative to the state, some of our states are potentially net exporters and others are net importers. But that being said, state like Oregon is allocated resources across our system. And so the way we serve our Oregon load is by developing and allocating resources across the entire footprint. And so there is an attribution of sort from our resources to state load that's done retroactively at the end of the year when we account for each state's share of the system. So the point here is that geographically, retail loads and generations are out of proportion. And if we were to try to assess like actual real-time energy transfers, for example, in Washington, we would be a net exporter on average. So resource allocation in the GHG reporting perspective, Washington isn't actually an importer. So based on, and I'll go into more detail around this, but based on our GHG reporting framework, we are actually accounted for as an importer into Washington, while the resource footprint would show us as an exporter. So I cover all this because I think it's important as we think about, you know, our overall attempt to capture sort of in real time how resources are serving load, because there is this disconnect that on, you know, color coding electrons, but it's important to highlight the benefits of a cost allocated system. So alignment between cost and resource compliance is important. It ensures benefits to our ratepayer investments are realized and claimed appropriately. It leverages geographic diversity to decarbonize and complies with one state's laws and regulations without violating another state's law. The reverse of that, framed like through a problem statement, is if state policies change to base compliance on data from market operator, data intended to inform settlements, and use that to represent energy serving Pacific Core retail load, adverse effects could result. So there could be a disconnect between costs and benefit claims of resources paid for by retail customers. That wouldn't be equivalent with our long-term clean energy plans that we've developed, and it would ultimately disincentivize market participation. So we are often asked, you know, most recently from different stakeholders and regulators, how will joining ENDAM impact Pacific Core's compliance with various emissions reduction standards? And given the complexity that I just went through, and a lot more in terms of how we do accounting, some of which came through when Elizabeth was going through her slide deck, is that, you know, this is a complex subject, and it will require working with our regulators pretty closely, as well as CAISO and others. But let's talk about sort of how we currently do accounting for multi-jurisdictional system. So regulators, including those that govern GHG pricing policies, have unique provisions for multi-jurisdictional utilities. So our base emissions and clean energy compliance on resources paid for by retail customers. And it's reflective of what the state's utility commission approves in terms of cost sharing agreements. In Washington, where Pacific Core's BAAs overlap the border, for the purpose of bilateral wholesale transactions, we worked with regional stakeholders to propose a position that Pacific Core BAA with a final point of delivery in the state, Pacific Core is an electricity importer, meaning that our BAA is essentially considered outside the state. So as part of the GHG working group principles, we wanted to enable congruency. Market design should support or align with state greenhouse gas regulation policies to the extent practicable. So in this case, one potential problem statement is if the methodology for Pacific Core's emissions accounting from centralized market activity, such as with those with Washington CCA, is not consistent with existing methodology for imported electricity from bilateral transactions or imported electricity to serve retail load, then the Washington GHG regulation area reporting will be incomplete or inaccurate. What this is trying to say is that if I'm looking from Washington's perspective and our contribution to overall Washington GHG footprint, there are at least 3 different ways that accounting is done for our system. One is for retail load, one is from bilateral transactions, and one is through centralized markets. And all 3 have to be congruent to produce a holistic total emissions picture. Okay, so I want to take a few minutes to talk about what establishing imports might look like in our various regulations. So in California, PacifiCorp has retail service territory, but our BAA is considered outside, and most of the resources that serve California retail load are outside. Under CARB's MRR rule, we're effectively always an importer when serving retail load, other than the small QFs that are in the state. The rest of our retail load is assumed to be served by our system mix from outside the state. In addition to our GHG footprint from retail load, we have EIM imports to California from PacifiCorp system. So that when they're deemed delivered from resources on our system into California, those same imports are reduced from our own claims when we're doing the system mix. This is effectively the same way that's done in Oregon. So EIM deeming is considered to be a specified sale off of our own resources. In Washington, we have retail service territory and generating resources that exceed our retail load. So it's significantly different in the positioning relative to California. We also have that issue of our BAA overlapping the state border. Under ecologies, WAC 173-446, retail load is assumed to be served by combination of cost allocated share of in-state generation and imported power from the rest of our system outside the state. And so there's already an accounting mechanism for how majority of our load in Washington is being served. For the purpose of bilateral wholesale transactions from PAC's BAA with the final point of delivery in Washington, PacifiCorp is always an electricity importer, meaning our BAA is considered outside the state. So effectively, if energy crosses our own BAA across the geographic border, that's still considered outside. So for WEIM imports to California from Washington resources, there are GHG costs and obligations for both states. There can be. Currently, both CARB and Ecology are considering rules for preventing double counting, meaning we have resources in Washington that participate in EIM, and they can get deemed delivered into California. So we have a thermal resource that can get deemed delivered to California with GHG obligation in the state of Washington and potentially picking up a GHG obligation in California. The same way we have hydro resources that get deemed delivered into California from Washington. So there's potential of accounting for both states. So my first recommendation here, specific to Washington regulation, is that energy transfers within centralized market, energy transfers across Washington's geographic state boundary that occurs within PAC's own BAA should not be considered an import into the GHG regulation area. This is consistent with the treatment we sought under bilateral wholesale transactions. Instead, PacifiCorp transfers to BAAs fully inside Washington from PacifiCorp system should be considered an import into the state other than from resources located in the state. In terms of market design, implementing GHG attribution consistent with this treatment is going to be important. Meaning, if there's a metering of energy transfer across a geographic border that's still within our BAA, that would not incur automatically a GHG attribution unless it leaves our BAA and goes to another BAA within Washington. So reporting of WEIM and EDM activity enable accounting of this treatment. So as part of the market design and all the reporting we've been discussing earlier today, I think it's important when that data is being aggregated to represent a specific geography, that this accounting of multi-state BAAs is considered as part of the calculus. I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. I know I just went through a lot, and I'm happy to go back and cover anything else before I move on to the next set. Okay. All right. Not hearing anything. So a few minutes about the non-GHG price-based policy in Oregon, and Elizabeth covered some of this as well. So Pacific Power has retail service territory in Oregon with majority of our generating resources located outside of Oregon. The no coal provision under SB 1547 and emissions reduction mandates are non-GHG pricing programs that rely on the cost allocation approved by Oregon Public Utility Commission as part of the accounting for and establishing of our compliance with those regulations. And so similar to what I've mentioned, EIM, after the fact deeming to California, is treated as a specified wholesale sale and deducted from our system mix when we do accounting. Again, specific to the reporting aspect, when market operators supplies reports to regulators on day-ahead or real-time transfer activity, data intended to inform settlements, transactions involving multi-jurisdictional retail providers and BAs that overlap geographic areas such as PacifiCorp will require additional consideration and characterization to ensure it is consistent with data reported to the state, consistent with other data reported to the state. So a little more in terms of our recommendation. There's a lot here, so I'll walk through it slowly because this is essentially a lot of what all this boils down to. EDAM settlements from PAC resources to GHG regulation areas. So this is from our system into GHG regulation areas. Transactions across geographic state boundaries that occur within our BAA is not considered an import into the GHG regulation area, as currently is the case in California, and we're proposing this for Washington as part of centralized market accounting. PacifiCorp is an importer into a Washington GHG regulation area only when the transfer occurs from PAC system resources outside to a BA that's fully inside. So this is a way to be able to incrementally establish our contribution to Washington's, GHG footprint as a result of imports from centralized markets. Deemed specified imports into GHG regulation areas, California and Washington, are considered specified sales, and compliance reporting reduces claims from associated environmental attributes. So for PacifiCorp, when we currently have deeming, for example, of our hydro resources into a GHG regulation area, we consider that clean energy attribute essentially used. And so we don't double count the RECs associated with that transaction for any other purpose. And it's our recommendation that as we develop programs that any kind of specified deeming is treated accordingly. So EDAM settlements from Pacific Core resources between Washington and California GHG regulation areas. Washington resources deemed to California should be considered specified transferred and should only be claimed once for both GHG and clean energy claims. Like I said, both CARB and Ecology are currently considering regulation to address dual claims. I think some of that conversation's around specifically GHG, but the same should apply for clean energy attributes as well. And then to address EDAM settlements to Pacific Core's own BAA for reporting to our states, EDAM and WIM transfer to PAC BAA, such as during periods of resource insufficiency, would be considered a net import, like an unspecified market purchase, and allocated to the GHG regulation area retail load, or our Oregon retail load based on state cost allocation factors. In the case where we could change the treatment of unspecified power to be something other than the unspecified rate, that would apply here as well. But for most part, this is talking about the megawatt hours associated with net imports into Pacific Core's own BAAs. Any questions?
We have one, Jessica. Go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Zapier. Thank you for all this.
Hi.
I'm gonna have to think through it as a lot here. But I just had a question on the last bullet. When you say transfers into the PAC BA, such as during periods of resource insufficiency, do you specifically mean like an RSE failure, or do you mean just you're a net importer to the PAC BA during an interval?
Thanks for that question. So that's just one example, but as a net importer, which could also occur as a result of, economic dispatch, right? So anything that is a net increase of megawatts on our system from the market would be considered like a market purchase.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
We have another hand from Anya. Oh, maybe she just
go ahead.
Anya, do you still have a question? Oh, it looks like she dropped. Maybe oh, there she is. Anya, go ahead.
Hi, just checking. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, Zipporah, thank you so much for this overview. I think that the issues you raise are going to require some additional unpacking in future meetings and some coordination with states. I think with some of the previous recommendations, in light of the recommendation of potentially some changes to attribution, we might want to kind of think through those after kind of states weigh in terms of what those final requirements should be for multi-jurisdictional entities. But in kind of thinking about CAISO's role and what we can help with here, I'm wondering if it would also be beneficial to potentially provide more context for the data that we provide to entities to describe what it is and isn't, so that there isn't an apples to oranges comparison, outside of, the settlement information that's currently provided. If there's kind of more context that would be helpful, or if there's a way we should be thinking about the data that we provide that could help with some of the problem statements that you've identified here.
Thank you. Yes, so I definitely think it requires a regulatory input as part of that conversation. And so we we will need to really think about, if there's a way to capture that incremental portion, assuming that, for example, in Washington, as part of the centralized market rulemaking, there's a way to have Washington acknowledge sort of the recommendation here, which is that our BA is treated outside the state. Then we would look to figure out, okay, what are the transactions that would be considered incremental to our system serving load in Washington, and as part of, our centralized market contribution or transactions into the state that should be additive to our retail load, calculation. And so I thank you for raising that, because I do think we need a little more context from our regulators around how this will work and whether they agree that this is how it should work. And then that will really help inform how we look at the data. And absent that, my presentation here is just flagging that needs to happen, and that when data comes through and it involves Pacific Core BAA, we need to think about if there's potential, what that data was measuring at the time, and whether it was also measuring our sort of retail load contribution to that area, and sort of how do we separate the retail load and incremental contribution from centralized markets involving our resources.
Thank you for that additional background.
Yes. And so my final thoughts here are, based on what we know today and based on the cost allocation framework and accounting that we have in our various states, I think there's a way to maintain cost allocated framework and still account for EDAM transactions incrementally to ensure environmental compliance reporting is complete, but still honors that cost allocated agreement between our states. As I mentioned, this will require close collaboration with our regulators and with CAISO in terms of, how we, look at our system data for the purpose of compliance reporting. We also welcome a dialogue with regional stakeholders to brainstorm ideas around these complexities. And like I said, I think, BPA, for example, may have other unique considerations, and Avista, their own, everyone's system, multi-state system looks different. And even within our own system, as I've shared, our footprint in California is significantly different than that of Washington and Oregon. So, I think it's important for regional stakeholders to understand that these complexities exist. That doesn't mean that this should be a hindrance to our market participation, nor our, goal of achieving decarbonization on our own footprint and across the region. I think it can be done. It's going to take some, working together. I think that's it.
Thanks, Sapir. And it looks like we have 2 more questions in queue. So let's go to Claire from WPTF.
Hey, thanks again. Appreciate that, Sapir. I don't actually have a question. I have a couple comments and a couple of observations. First, generally, what you've presented here is consistent with my understanding of both the California and the Washington state programs in terms of how their regulatory construct currently treats multi-jurisdictional retail providers. And it is also consistent with that electricity imports paper that many of us worked on and developed, which has tacitly been approved by Washington Ecology. So I just want to flag that I think you generally have it right. I do also want, and I think the second comment is actually as much targeted for CAISO. To Zapira's point about needing additional thought, I think it is critical to recognize, as Zapira said, that different multi-state BAAs may be situated differently. And right now, I think currently we're all thinking about PacifiCorp and BPA, but I've heard some inkling, I don't know if BPA is on the phone, I've heard some inkling that BPA might want the ability for specified imports to be attributed to their Washington load, and that would require a different framework for BPA than PAC. Additionally, as you said, we don't know what Avista would do. There may be other multi-state BAAs that pop up in the future and may want the ability to allow specified imports for load within the greenhouse gas zone. And I guess the last comment would be that I think this also ties into our previous comment around reporting metrics and as Zapira's flagged, the non-pricing programs, because my understanding is that without some ability to claim particular resources as an accounting exercise within the centralized market, any attribution, there wouldn't be a resource specific attribution to PacifiCorp. You'd have to do that through the cost allocation, but it is possible to conceive that a mechanism within the CAISO markets could allow those resources to be identified as committed or claimed by PacifiCorp. So just noting that I think there's a linkage there that we should also explore. Thanks again, Zapira.
Thanks, Claire.
Let's go to Jessica Zano.
Hi, Zapira. One more question for you. I was just curious your thoughts. If what you're proposing, do you see it as being durable if your cost allocation was, methodology was to change over time?
I do, because I mean, that's one of the reasons why, maintaining the cost allocation is important, because within a particular state, again, the way I've been thinking about this is like, incremental blocks of our GHG footprint within a particular state paradigm, right? So we have the cost allocated portion that serves our retail load, but we also want to account for, imports into the state from centralized markets that we contributed to. And so thinking in terms of what those two contributions are and how do we account for those, in a way that's incremental and not double counted. I think at least for the initial EDAM rollout, and our MSP multi-state protocol stakeholders are thinking through these as well. They're talking through these as well. I think it provides the flexibility to continue, but it's different than what I would say is like accounting for the entire retail load from based on sort of markets dispatch or market operator view of like, here's the resource stack that I think you use to serve your own load. I think yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think I understand and following what you're saying. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And like I said, even just as an example of the effort that it took for our bilateral wholesale transaction treatment in Washington, it was like a 4-month process with a lot of stakeholders to come together and think through these complexities. And so, like I said, I think the framework is there. We do need our regulators to help us sort of provide some cues into if they agree with this concept, so we can continue to build on it. And so we are looking to do that with Washington as they're working on their centralized market rulemaking, and seek the same with California and Oregon. All right. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Zipur. And I'm not seeing any additional comments or questions. So thanks for your time today. All right, well, we are a little bit ahead of schedule. So let's go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break, get some water, refill coffee, and then come back here at, let's see, 11:06 Pacific time. And we'll get started with the discussion on the consolidated problem statements. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back from our short break, everyone. So a lot of good discussion this morning from the ISO, the Department of Environmental Quality, and PacifiCorp. So thanks again to all of our presenters for their time this morning. Since we are a bit ahead of schedule, we'll go ahead and start with the discussion on the consolidated problem statements and then finish it up after lunch. But based on the feedback we received during the October working groups and through written comments, there was some consensus that we should consolidate the problem statements, trying to winnow it down to a more manageable number than, the 16 that we had originally. So we've worked on some consolidated problem statements, getting that down to 8 statements. And so as we go through these, we're looking for feedback on how we've reframed and organized these statements. Really, is the summarization accurate? Do additional issues still need to be extrapolated? So keep that in mind as we go through, and we'd love to hear from you. So the problem statement development is an iterative process. So you've seen this diagram before, but just like to include as a reminder. So we first define the problem, gather information and synthesize, then decide and take action and monitor and evaluate. And, some of these aspects will feed into the other. So right now we're focusing on the synthesize information and then, having more discussion around these items as well. But before we do that, we want to define some of the statements or phrases that are in some of these problem statements. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sylvie, and she's going to take us through some of these proposed definitions.
Thanks, Isabella. My name is Sylvie. I'm a senior policy developer for the California ISO. I'm going to start with a little bit of a caveat and add some color to what you see on the screen. So we'll offer the following definitions of certain key phrases and terms to simplify the process of defining problem statements. The ISO recognizes that there may be some disagreements in precise definitions, especially around the conceptual understanding of these things. And I'm really going to focus on some technical definitions that highlight key terms that are in the following problem statements. But as an economist, I really like precise definitions of things so that I can model them and translate them into market design. So I really appreciate this group's call to action to have precise definitions of these concepts. But as a market operator, we focus on a limited set of questions. We ask, how do we minimize costs? How do we settle costs and benefits optimally? Can we make a solution better by increasing benefits without imposing a cost elsewhere? When it comes to defining terms like leakage or resource shuffling, you really need to start with a different set of questions that are not under the ISO's jurisdiction. For example, what counts as a cost, or how might market participants define costs and benefits differently? And in GHG, in the context of leakage, those questions are driven by regulators and not the ISO. So in the next couple of slides, I'll provide some basic technical definitions to frame the market design elements that we focus on in the problem statements. And later, maybe in December, when we get into a deep dive on the existing GHG design, we can look more closely at how we minimize costs given how regulators have defined those. I'll pause there, see if there's any questions or comments on that. All right. So some ISO market definitions. Secondary dispatch, we have defined as the megawatt quantity below a resource's baseline that receives a GHG award. Baseline here is really a catch-all, an acknowledgement that the counterfactual in the EIM is different than the counterfactual in EDAM. So encompassing both, baseline is the megawatt quantity of a resource that would likely have been dispatched regardless of the opportunity to serve demand in a GHG area. And this baseline is used as a counterfactual to determine the megawatt quantity of that resource that can be attributed to a GHG area. Next slide. The baseline in the WEIM today is a resource's self-submitted base schedule. This is going to look different in EDAM. The baseline for EIM-only resources will continue to be a resource's self-submitted base schedule. The baseline for EDAM resources in the IFM will be an optimized counterfactual that comes out of the GHG reference path. And those are the definitions that we thought were important for understanding the consolidated problem statements that we'll review today. And as I mentioned, we can go deeper into this and put it into context as we do the deep dive into the current and future GHG design. I'll pause there for questions.
We have a hand from Callie Wells.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. I guess more of a high-level initial reaction to the definition of baseline here. So I know the way it's being defined is really, and how it's being used to also define secondary dispatch is based on, how it works in the market today. But I'm wondering if it makes sense to create some sort of definition for baseline and secondary dispatch that, is something that could adapt to if the way we establish the baseline in the market might change down the road. So obviously there's one mechanism in the market today, whether or not, changes to that take place down the road is unknown at this point. So I know when I saw this definition of secondary dispatch, my initial reaction was that makes sense given how things work today. So I'm wondering if we might want to define it a little bit more, I guess adaptable might be the right term there, so that it can change and still make sense, even if how we establish the baseline changes.
Yeah, I hear you asking for a conceptual definition, and that makes a lot of sense, something that is more broadly applicable. And I think we can talk more about that when we go into the deep dive. I think it requires more of an understanding of how we translate the costs defined by regulators into market design. But that's good feedback.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That makes sense. And we'll continue to think about it and reflect something in our comments, but I just wanted to provide kind of like the initial reaction I had to these, just so that we can think through them.
That makes total sense. Thank you, Callie.
Hey, do we have any other questions for Sylvia on definitions? All right. Well, thank you, Sylvie.
Thank you.
Okay. So before we jump into the problem statements discussion, we have identified some areas of further exploration. So if we move into those, they mainly focus on the market operations and GHG design. So what we've heard from stakeholders is that they're seeking greater understanding of the current EDM and WEIM GHG design in order to inform and refine future problem statements. So we have some of these topics listed here on this slide, so I'll go through them, and then I'll pause for some feedback on what's listed here, and then take any suggestions on anything that isn't captured here as well. So the first being, how does the EDM and WEIM baseline or counterfactual work? 2, how is attribution determined? 3, is attribution determined by the optimization or does it occur after the fact? 4, what energy does the WEIM and EDM consider to be eligible to be attributed to serve demand in a GHG regulation area? 5, how much secondary dispatch is occurring both in the WEIM and EDM? What is the associated cost of secondary dispatch? What trade-offs occur between limiting secondary dispatch and the GHG costs in the WEIM and EDM? Is there sufficient transparency in the total marginal GHG cost? And does the GHG cost in the market reflect actual cost of GHG to end-use customers? So I'll pause here and get any feedback on what we have listed here and any suggestions for topics that we haven't captured that you think should be included. And just again, this isn't a problem statement, but just suggestions on future topics for discussion. Okay. Mary, go ahead. Can we unmute Mary Winke's line?
Hi there, thanks. This is Mary Winke with the Public Generating Pool. I think I have, and maybe you have this somewhere else as well, but I have a question that I think could be added to this list, which is sort of a question about what is the emissions impact of the GHG design? And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean the quantification of secondary dispatch or sort of the quantity of emissions that are attributed to California, but the impact of the design on overall footprint emissions.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. And I think we have that captured in a later problem statement that we'll cover today.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jessica, we unmute Jessica's line.
Yeah, I think there was another question that was raised by Alyssa Bonneville about, and I think we all have it, about the competition between, I guess, attribution between Washington and California in the future Washington implementation. And I think that's a big question that belongs in this list.
Okay.
Like, what does that look like?
Okay, yeah, and I think that's something we could kind of talk about as part of number 2 here of how is attribution determined. So
Perfect.
we'll take, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Greg? We unmute Greg Alderson's line.
I just wanted to note, as we talk about the attribution items here, we should discuss them in the context of not just California and Washington being states with a price, but also those states with a durable decarbonization policy that is not based on a price. So I don't think that's a separate question, but I think a consideration as CAISO provides information and drives discussion on these questions.
Okay, thanks, Greg. All right, any other feedback on these before we move into the consolidated problem statements? Okay, not seeing any. So let's get into number 1. So our first consolidated problem statement here is the optimization does not take the explicit cost of secondary dispatch into account and therefore may not balance optimized attribution with constraints to limit secondary dispatch. So I'll pause here and get any feedback on this problem statement. Is this an accurate representation of the problem? Todd Ryan?
Morning, Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. I just want to say that I think you did a great job on this one. I personally believe that this is something that would be interesting to look at and understand. If the cure is worse than the disease, so to speak. Thanks.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate that. Any other feedback on this statement? Okay, not seeing any, so we'll move to this. Oh, here we go. Callie. Go ahead, Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wills with WPTF. I guess I had more of a question, and I think I know the answer, but I just wanted to confirm. When you say the optimization does not take the explicit cost of secondary dispatch into account, you are more talking about the cost, like the cost benefit analysis somebody would do to compare either the status quo versus maybe making some changes to how the attribution would limit secondary dispatch. Is that the cost you're referring to? Not like an actual, or are you talking about the actual GHG cost used in the optimization?
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Anya or Sylvie to confirm exactly the cost.
I can take this one. So the optimized attribution process takes into account the GHG cost of allowances or of compliance that's submitted by resources. Constraints to limit secondary dispatch are based on a different cost source. It's not necessarily the costs of GHG that are submitted by the resources that attribution takes into account, but instead the cost of secondary dispatch. So when we limit that, we may limit, how the attribution process optimizes the GHG compliance as submitted by resources, but it's intended to also limit the cost of secondary dispatch. Because those two sources are different, we may see, a different balance of costs and benefits in the market.
Okay, I think I understand what you guys are trying to capture here. Okay, I'll think through more about whether or not if there's a way to clarify that, because there's kind of two different costs that one can think of when talking about this trade-off between, the current attribution process and limiting secondary dispatch with, and the impact that has on the market versus, whether or not it makes sense to make some changes that I think the prior commenter was also trying to get at. So, all right, thank you.
Exactly, and we'd really appreciate your input in trying to clarify this. Thanks, Callie.
Yeah. Thanks, Callie. All right, we'll move to problem statement 2. So the current GHG design does not limit attribution to only capacity above the baseline, which results in the potential for secondary dispatch. Any feedback here on how this has been summarized? Any ways we can refine this further, or is it good as is? You can continue to comment on these through written comments too. Looks like we have a hand from Bonnie Blair. Adrian, can we unmute Bonnie's line? Thanks.
Isabella?
Yep, I can hear you now. Hi, Bonnie.
Great. Hi. Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. Could you maybe tease out, or could Sylvie tease out the difference between problem statement 1 and problem statement 2. I mean, it seems like they're obviously related, and I'm having trouble seeing exactly what the focus, what the difference between the two is intended to be, or why there's a need to have both of them as opposed to somehow merging them.
Sure. And I think this also reflects Callie's previous statement where in problem statement 1, we're talking about 2 potentially different sources of cost. So problem statement 2 does extrapolates more on the source of cost that's driven by secondary dispatch, because attribution is not limited to capacity of the baseline. We have this other source of cost. In problem statement 1, we're saying, how do we balance the cost described in this problem statement with the costs submitted by market participants for GHG compliance?
Okay,
down from problem statement 1.
So is the distinction that problem statement 1 is sort of based more on evaluating cost identification versus problem statement 2 is more a kind of a policy focus?
I think it just highlights that there are different cost sources and therefore different solutions. So the solution to the, I'm using the word cost a lot. So the solution to secondary dispatch are these constraints that we've put in the market. And that's different from attribution. So in problem statement 2, we're just highlighting the unique problem of secondary dispatch. And in problem statement 1, we talk about how the different solutions we put in the market might balance.
Okay, all right, that helps. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bonnie. Any other comments, questions from the group? Okay, and then we'll move to problem statement 3. So attribution is not scalable because it creates the potential for secondary dispatch. This secondary dispatch could increase with market expansion. So again, any feedback on this statement here? All right, again, not hearing anything. So we'll move to problem statement 4. Okay, so a little bit more here. So when there are multiple unlinked GHG regulation areas or different reporting requirements by different states, market participation may result in double counting, undercounting, or inconsistent counting of emissions. And variations of this issue could include using both the total WEIM transfer data and cost-based accounting, using both total WEIM attribution and systems to allocate generation and associated emissions to retail load, for example, RECs, and between unlinked jurisdictions if one area uses generation-based accounting and another area uses load-based accounting. So again, any feedback here on this consolidated problem statement and if we've captured everything under this statement or if there's still details that need to be extrapolated here. Any feedback? And again, you'll have opportunity to comment on these through written comments as well. Okay. All right. Well, then we'll assume this is good as is for now. Okay. Problem statement 5, which focuses on the emissions accounting and reporting topic. The ISO does not provide all metrics desired by market participants. So this includes demonstration of the impact of the market on decarbonization and renewable curtailment, and information is lacking to LSEs in jurisdictions with non-price-based emissions reduction policies to fulfill reporting obligations with state policy, such as market imports to serve load. This could undermine efforts to decarbonize, as the unspecified emissions rate used by states with an absolute reduction program fails to reflect the accuracy of generation and consumption at a local level. So I'll pause here again to see if we've captured this accurately or if there's additional information needed here. Okay, I see some hands. So Jessica, let's go ahead and unmute Jessica Zono's line.
Yeah, thank you. I don't really know exactly how to capture this or add this, but like not just the metrics being provided, but the flexibility to the flexibility around metrics. So like to the extent possible as we evolve, being able to tailor the information that you receive as a market participant. I don't know, maybe this isn't the right place for it, but I feel like it could be.
Okay. Yeah, thanks
So
for
like
that.
earlier, yeah, when Kevin was talking about the different configurations that the ISO took when it and assumptions it made when it calculated average emissions. So those kinds of things and toggles and parameters that potentially market participants could control itself, the information that and how the assumptions it makes in the information.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's helpful. And if as you think on it more, if you have suggestions on on the level of flexibility you're looking for, if you could put those in your comments too, that would be really helpful.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Greg Alderson.
Thanks. Yeah, I think wanted to just associate ourselves with this particular problem statement. I think the second item reflects some of what we see as an Oregon utility, where there is a need for better data about imports. So I think this problem statement is an important one. I think it fits well with the discussion we had this morning. So I think it's an issue of figuring out exactly how to package and present the information, and perhaps in several different ways. But I think this is an important one that needs more exploration. So I'm glad to see it on the list.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Okay, any other feedback on problem statement 5? Okay, we'll move to 6. We are moving through these quick. Okay, so number 6, there is not a market mechanism for utilities operating in states with a declining cap on emissions to ensure load is served by generation and wholesale market transfers that meet those emission reduction targets. So again, I'll pause here, seeking the same feedback on if this is an accurate statement or if there are further details that need to be teased out here. Any feedback before we move on? Okay, then we'll move on to problem statement 7. Okay, so there is not a market mechanism for utility in a state with a declining cap on emissions to offer generation to the market on a portfolio basis, regardless of point of consumption, that meets the state's emissions target over a given time period. So again, I'll pause here for any feedback on this statement. Callie, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Can you help me understand the distinction between 6 and 7? They seem, at least to me, and I might be a little bit more removed from this problem than others, what the distinction is being made between those two, or if it makes more sense to combine them into one.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. And maybe Sylvie and Anya can explain the nuances here. Anya, I see your hand raised.
Sure, thanks, Callie. Let's go back to the prior problem statement for a moment. I think it's kind of two sides of the same issue, and so I think we could combine it as one problem statement with 2 sub-issues. But again, for a state with a declining cap on emissions, there's both the need to ensure that load being served in that geographic area is able to meet those emission reduction targets. And then problem statement 6 is more from the utility perspective of, and can we go to the next problem statement, that when the generation is offered, that its portfolio over a certain time period can meet those state requirements. Is that helpful? And I think we're open to kind of combining them or viewing them as separately. And are seeking feedback on what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I missed that nuance that one is load, one is supply. So you're kind of separating the market into supply versus load in these problem statements. Yeah, that, I mean, for efficiency, it might make sense just to combine them into one problem statement rather than separate them into 2. But okay, I appreciate that clarification there.
No, I think that's a good discussion. And if we move to the next problem statement, I think it'd be a good discussion from the working group as well of if 6, 7, and 8 should all be combined. Problem statement 8, and Isabella will get into this, is really for a state that has a price on carbon and that declining cap, how do you have a market mechanism that essentially facilitates both requirements? So 6, 7, and 8 are all very much linked.
I appreciate that segue. That was actually my reaction to all 3 of those problem statements, that they all seem very, very much related. And rather than have 3 separate ones, it might make more sense to just combine them into one problem statement.
Appreciate that feedback. That's great.
Yeah, thanks, Callie. And if you have suggestions on what that would look like, we'd be happy to take those too. Maybe if you have them in written comments. Okay, but as Anya kind of segued into problem statement 8 here, we have there is not a market mechanism for states with both a price on carbon and a declining cap on emissions to reflect both requirements in the market. So any feedback on problem statement 8 or problem statements 6 through 8 and further consolidating these? Sylvie, I see your hand raised.
Isabella. I think the way they've been separated now, as Anya mentioned, acknowledges that there's different market participants that are involved in each. And so I'd be interested in hearing, especially from the utilities, more about what the problem, how they view the problem, because separated out, I think, helps us identify, specific solutions that might address the different problems. So before we go about consolidating them, I think it would be helpful to understand how utilities are planning to go about this currently. Are they looking to attempt to assess, their own portfolios, make buying decisions based on a certain metric, or is market constraint more appropriate? And to understand that, I think it would be helpful to just get a little bit more detail around the problems facing these market participants that are highlighted in each of the problem statements.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvie. And I'll open it back up to the group to see if there's any responses to Sylvie's comment. Claire, let's go ahead and unmute. Claire is from WPTF's line.
Process question. And what I'm curious about is how do the problem statements, how are the problem statements going to influence our work going forward? In other words, I guess what I'm trying to get to and thinking about 6, 7, and 8 is by the fact that we have 3 separate but related problem statements, does that imply 3 different work items, which I think would be completely unreasonable since these are very related issues. If, however, we are recognizing that there is going to be a need to further discuss non-pricing programs, problem statement 6, 7, and 8 become kind of subvariants of the broader problem, which could be one chunk of work. So just kind of a question, because I think that the answer to that question should steer whether we collapse these into a single problem statement or not. Thank you.
Yeah, good question, Claire. And I think how we envision this going is if the problem statements are very closely interrelated, then we would have a discussion that kind of encompasses all 3 of them. Or if we can hone in on a topic that has a few problem statements and address it that way so that we are limiting the amount of different work streams we have going on. That's the goal. And there will also be an opportunity to kind of sequence these problem statements in order of priority for discussion as we move forward in the working group process so that we can start to outline more topics for future working groups. So that will segue into our Slido polling questions here in a minute. But before we get to that, I just want to see if there are any additional comments on any of these consolidated problem statements. Callie?
Yeah, hi. Promise last time you'll hear from me today on these problem statements. Callie Wells, WPTF. So last meeting, if I recall, there were some problem statements about price formation and price transparency. And I don't see those on here. Does that mean that this meeting was just focusing on the problem statements you have, or are those no longer on the table?
I think that if those problem statements still exist or haven't been captured under the consolidated problem statements, I think we tried to encompass that under the consolidated problem statement number 1. But if you feel like it's not captured sufficiently, then we'd love to hear that feedback.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think problem statement 1 or maybe 2, I think the price formation issue with secondary dispatch, suppressing price signals. I think somehow incorporating that, because problem 1 uses the term cost, which is different than price formation. And so somehow ensuring accurate price formation is captured is, I think, essential, especially when we're talking secondary dispatch. And then the other one was more price transparency, and that got down to how the individual LMP components are derived because of the way resources in the GHG area bid their emissions within their energy bid, and resources outside the GHG area have a separate bidding component. And what that does when we start breaking down the L&P into its different components. So I know that was a very nuanced problem statement last time that we talked about. I think we had a discussion with George on that one. But we would like to see that again captured. I didn't see one where that would naturally fit. So I just wanted to raise that.
Okay, thanks for that feedback, Callie. Okay. Okay, well, that takes us to our, oh, looks like we have one more hand raised from PG&E. So could we unmute Sam Johnson? Oh, maybe that was by mistake. Sam has lowered the hand. Okay, well, that will take us into our working group schedule here. So we've laid out some dates for the working group through June of 2024, and many of the working group topics that we'll discuss during these upcoming meetings will be informed by problem statement readiness, the feedback we receive during these working group calls and through written comments, our staff bandwidth, and then also stakeholder presentation timing and interest in stakeholder presentations. But for December 21st, we are envisioning some discussion on attribution and the counterfactual. So we know that reporting and attribution is closely interrelated, so doing a bit of a deep dive on those two items. And then in January, focusing on emissions tracking and accounting and beyond price-based policy. But I see Stuart's hand raised, so I'll pause and we can unmute Stuart.
Nicosia, thank you. I just wonder if December 21 is a great date for all participants to get into this probably important topic, and Council may want to think about pushing that to, the first or second week in January. Just a thought.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I know it's close to the holiday, so we'll look at schedules and see what we can do there.
Thanks.
Yeah. Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to, this is just a process thing. I just wanted to request that if CAISO can announce the times of the meetings as far in advance as possible. My observation, at least, has been that while there's been a date set, there hasn't been a time set until a week or maybe a little more than a week, and it's pretty hard to get on people's calendars. With, when the all-day holds tend to sort of get ignored. And so, I know it's hard to schedule and plan. Today's a pretty good example of how fluid the amount of time that these take really is, and that it's hard to nail it down. But if you all are able to at least announce a time without an agenda, that would probably be helpful a little further in advance. And thank you for the work that's gone into this. I know these things take work to plan and put on.
Thanks, Greg, and absolutely, we'll try to get those times out sooner. Okay. Well, before we wrap things up and let you all go early for lunch, we have a few Slido polling questions that we'd like to get your feedback on. So, Adrian, if we could launch the first one. Okay. So for this first question, we're just asking you all to please sequence the following topic areas in the order of highest priority for discussion to lowest priority for discussion. And again, some of these responses will kind of influence the discussion topics for the upcoming working groups. And this won't be your only opportunity to comment on these things. We are planning to put out a survey that will cover kind of problem statement prioritization and topic prioritization as we move forward. So just take a minute here and sequence the following discussion topic areas, and we'll give you a few seconds to do that. And I've selected panelist answer, so my response should not show up in the results. Okay, so initially it's looking like emissions accounting and reporting would be number 1, followed by market operations and GHG design, then state coordination, and then beyond price-based policy. We'll give you a little bit more time here. It looks like we only have 28 responses right now. Okay, so still looking like emissions accounting and reporting is number 1, but just barely over market operations and GHG design. Okay, then let's go ahead and close out this poll and move to the next question. Okay, so this one's a little bit longer, so we'll give you some more time on this, but please sequence the consolidated problem statements in order of highest priority for discussion to lowest priority for discussion. And we just have a caveat here that the ISO is dedicated to addressing all of these problem statements, and we understand that some of these statements may change based on the feedback that we've received today. But we are committed to discussing all of these problem statements, but we'll use the top ones identified through this poll and then the survey that we'll send out to indicate some near-term priorities for assessment and future discussion. So we'll give you some time to answer this one. Okay, so it's looking like number 1 right now is the ISO does not provide all metrics desired by market participants. Looks like it shifted a little bit to number 1 being when there are multiple unlinked GHG regulation areas or different reporting requirements by different states, market participation may result in double counting, undercounting, or inconsistent counting of emissions. I'll give you a few more seconds to get your responses in, and then we have just 2 more open answers. Okay, and we'll publish these results to the webpage too, so that you can take a look at them after the call. Okay, so let's go ahead and close out this polling question and then open up our first open answer. Okay, so first open answer, just please provide any questions you have on the current GHG design that you'd like the ISO to answer. And this could be a question that may not have been captured in that initial list that we shared under the areas of further exploration. So if you have any other questions on the current GHG design that you'd like more information on, go ahead and put the question in here. I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to do that. You can either choose to submit your response under your name, or you can select to submit it as anonymous, up to you. Okay, receiving a few questions here. I'll give you about 10 more seconds. And if you think of something else, you can put those in your written comments as well, or you can send us an email after the meeting today. Okay, let's go ahead and close out this polling question and open up our last one. Okay, last question. Please provide any other feedback on the prioritization of problem statements that has not already been captured. If you have any other feedback, go ahead and list that here. I'll give you another 30 seconds to a minute to submit that. Any other feedback on the prioritization of problem statements that has not already been captured? And again, you can answer it under your name or select anonymous. I'll give you about 15 more seconds. And again, this isn't your last opportunity to submit feedback here. You can do it via email, through the comments template, or through the survey that we'll send out. All right, let's go ahead and close out the polling. And then I'll move into our last slide today before we let you go. So as far as next steps go, we'll be accepting comments till end of day, December 11th. So we'll get the template posted for you on the working group webpage so you can start working on those. And then again, we will be sending out a survey that will focus on some topic and problem statement prioritization. This will help us kind of define those working group discussion topics for the future ones we have scheduled. And then just a reminder that we do have the next working group on December 21st, but we will look at the calendars and see if there are some alternative dates that we can have that one, just given the proximity to the holiday. And then if you are still interested in presenting, you can send your presentation requests to ISO Stakeholder Affairs at kaiso.com. And then the link to the working group webpage is provided here on this slide as well, where you can find all of the materials we discussed today, along with all past working group materials. So I'll pause here just to see if there are any last questions before we conclude for the day and wrap up early. All right, not seeing any. Well, thank you all so much for your participation, especially on the Monday after the holiday. We really appreciate it. And have a great rest of your week. Thanks.